Thank you very much. Since I'm based in Warsaw, first, very warm welcome once again. And I would also like to thank the organizers for inviting me and for this opportunity to share my view on the global economy, which I will discuss during this session. So I will start my presentation with outlining key economic trends and economic outlook for global economy and also for major economies. Then I will discuss risks and challenges that the global economy will have to face. And finally, I will conclude with main findings. So, starting with the most recent data on economic growth, we may first notice that in 2017, global economy grew at the fastest pace since 2011. More importantly, what we are now witnessing is the synchronized growth. Synchronized growth, I mean that 2/3 countries, accounting for about 3/4 of global output, actually recorded a growth in 2017 faster than the year before. So this is even more important than this increase by 0.6 percentage points in 2017, since what we actually have to emphasize is that it is a huge majority of global economy and majority of individual economies in terms of their absolute numbers that joined this synchronized growth. At the same time, we also observe a continuing growth in the euro area, Japan, China, and the US economy. All of them actually grew last year above expectations. As for the outlook and expectations, we may observe that different indicators such as manufacturing PMI and consumer confidence indicators showing expectations of managers and consumers as regards the nearest future, all of them have been improving. The yellow line stands for the world indicators, while the blue line stands for advanced economies indicators. So you may actually observe that this improvement has been particularly remarkable in the case of advanced economies. So their expectations of the nearest future are quite optimistic. And the same goes actually for the projections in the near term. Here we present economic outlook of the IMF, International Monetary Fund, for 2018 and for 2019 for the world economy. You may observe that after an increase last year, they expect still quite slight, but still an improvement in the global growth rate up to 3.9% in the current year and to stabilize at this rate in the year that follows. So this growth in 2018, 19, and 2020 as well is also to be supported by the US fiscal policy, changes in the tax policy that, according to the IMF, are to contribute to GDP in the American economy by 1.2% in the period up to 2020. At the same time, when we analyze the global growth, it turns out actually that emerging Asia, including China and India, actually remains the most important engine of global growth. When it comes to Euro area economy, it is Germany and Spain that remain actually the main engine of economic growth. However, recent data indicate that France and even also Italy catch up in terms of pretty favorable economic numbers. However, when it comes to medium-term outlook and comparison of the growth path with the growth path experienced prior to the crisis, we may notice that even the current upturn and medium-term outlook indicates pretty robust economic growth, however, remaining below the levels experienced in the pre-crisis period. And this is mainly due to advanced economies' somewhat slowdown in the long-term economic growth, which is largely due to aging and demographic changes, also reflected in falling rates of labor force participation, which I will discuss at the end of the presentation in more detail, and also the lower expected productivity growth. So you see these medium-term prospects indicate for the world economy pretty stable, however, slightly declining rate of growth. It is mostly we see decline in the US, EU, and also China, however, remaining still at a relatively high level growth path. Well, when you look at the structure of the world economy, you may notice that 5 top economies, that is US, EU, China, Japan, and India, in terms of their contribution to world GDP, they actually accounted for 70% of global gross domestic product last year. All of them, see this, but India, and actually this purple line stands for the growth in India. In all other major economies, you may notice that in the medium term, some slowdown in GDP growth is expected. Despite the slowdown, you may still notice that in China, it's still very high. It is still expected to remain at high level, however, slowing down somewhat. Still, it is only India where further acceleration in GDP growth is expected. But despite that slowdown in all other major economies, the world economic output seems to be growing at a more or less stable rate. That is largely due to gradual recovery in commodity exporters economies, and also the projected growth in India, I just mentioned. When we compare the distribution of economic growth across different economies, first, let's have a look back at the previous 10-year period. You may notice that over the last 10 years, among major economies and also other EU economies, China actually was a top performer in terms of economic growth. Over that 10-year period, the Chinese economy grew by more than 120% in total. The world economy grew at that time by almost 40%. Obviously, as more advanced economies, the US economy and EU economy grew much less, but still, their actual performance was badly affected by the global financial crisis. So the cumulative growth for the US and EU economy amounted to 15% and 9% respectively at that time. So it was much, much less than that of the Chinese economy. When we look at the next projected 5-year period, we may notice that this economic growth is going to be much more balanced relative to the previous period. But still, China, despite some slowdown, is going to be one of the most rapidly growing economies in the world, with a cumulative growth, as indicated here, amounting to 35% over the next 5 years, according to IMF projections. The US economy is expected to grow at a similar, if not somewhat higher pace than the EU economy during that time. And the world economy is to grow by 21% in cumulative terms over the next 5 years. Well, another aspect I would like to emphasize in this presentation is investment. Investment that I believe is also critical to your industry. And again, first let's have a look at the previous 10-year period. Here we may notice that China has been investing heavily over the last 10 years. Relative to GDP, investment on average amounted to 46%. It is a very high investment rate. For the world economy, it amounted to 25% over the same period. While for the EU or US, it amounted to 20 and 19% respectively. Obviously, in general, the more developed the country, usually has a smaller investment rate. One argument is that the marginal return on investment is decreasing over time. So it's not very unusual that developed economies experience lower investment rate, but still in China that was actually very high relative to many other countries. And the more interesting is obviously projection of investment rate, and the optimistic information is that currently we witness investment rebound in many countries. Also, an end of the contraction in investment in commodity exporters that we experienced in previous years in many countries. At the same time, in advanced economies, we also observe some increase in investment rate, and the same goes for the world economy. So we project, at least IMF projects, slight but still an increase in investment rate in the world economy to 26% from 25% in the previous 10-year period. In China, some slowdown is expected, but it's not very significant though. So, because China is going to experience investment rate according to projection at the level of 43%, still very, very high. But that was pretty optimistic, so maybe somewhat less optimistic are changes in the share of main sectors consuming steel products in total value added in major economies. Here you may observe, that the total share of industry and construction and total value added in the respective economy has been declining this century. In the US by 3.1 percentage points, in the EU by 3 percentage points. In China, the decline was more remarkable by 4.6 percentage points decline in the share of industry and construction. However, it was exclusively due to decline in the share of industry, manufacturing in particular, and total value added, because at that time, construction sector increased in its share in the economy. So, indeed, and also in China, in the next years to come, we should also expect more focus of authorities on services over manufacturing, and also emphasizing more consumption over investment activity. But despite this, investment rate is to remain at high level in China. Another important aspect related to global recovery is an improvement in trade volumes that we also experienced last year in 2017. So we see an improvement in the volumes of trade in the world economy and also in major economies around the world. So in the Europe, Germany and United Kingdom, other major economies, that is Japan, USA, and China, all of them actually were strong contributors to global recovery in exports last year. Importantly, trade volumes are forecasted to increase in the years to come, and this is what we can observe here in the projection horizon, that trade volumes are expected to increase. However, in terms of GDP, it is not going to happen. There will be slight increase in the world economy in terms of for trade to GDP ratio. However, it will remain at the level below the pre-crisis period. So we see it here. So in terms of exports to GDP, which we often call openness of the economy, the global tendency that we had observed for many decades has come to a halt, at least for a while. So trade more or less goes in line with GDP growth in the projected few-year horizon. One exception is European Union, where we see further expansion of trade, especially to countries outside of the European Union. But the exports actually doesn't tell the whole story. If you compare exports of one industry to exports of another industry, it doesn't allow you to compare the role of a given industry for the economy. What is actually important is value added, exported value added, because you can export for $1 billion, but it may be based on imports components. Well, say 90% of that may be based on imports. So the actual value added amounts to 10% of that exports. So, and this is what is actually measured by so-called exported value added. And exported value added shows the importance of foreign demand for a given economy. So here we illustrate what share of total value added generated in a given economy is exported. So what part of the GDP is accounted for external demand. And here you may observe that European economies, it is also due to their smaller size of individual economies when compared to China and the US. But you may actually observe that they are much more integrated into so-called global value chains because the role of external demand for their economy is much higher than that for China, USA, or Japan, or Brazil, other major economies in the world. So they are exposed to foreign demand to a much larger extent than many other countries. And of particularly remarkable increase of importance of foreign demand has been recorded for Central and Eastern European countries. Here you see this exported value added relative to total value added, how it has grown over the last decades in the Central and Eastern Europe, which indicates that more and more of generated value added, of GDP of a given country, is actually absorbed abroad. So foreign demand, its importance has been increasing for these countries. And this blue, dark blue color illustrates what share of cumulative GDP growth in Central and Eastern Europe has been due to increase in foreign demand, so an increase in exported value added. So it indicates that in all these countries but Romania, foreign demand an increase in foreign demand accounted for majority of this economy's growth, GDP growth, in 21st century. This is a fact that is often not discussed in public, actually. It's omitted in discussion because it's very often that, for example, for countries like Poland, there is a lot of focus on domestic demand. However, the role of foreign demand seems to be underestimated. And the last slide on this indicates an increase in the share of exported value added in total value added in the selected countries. So it actually illustrates how importance of foreign demand has grown over time for this country in terms of generating also their economic growth. And you may observe that in Central Eastern Europe, but also other European economies, including Turkey, the role of foreign demand has increased a lot in terms of its share in the total value added generated in a given country. Here we mark China at the level of 6.7 percentage point increase in the share of exported value added in total value added, which may seem not a lot relative to other European countries. However, if we take into account the size of the Chinese economy, that increase also has been pretty significant, indicating an increasing role of foreign markets for the Chinese economy over time. Well, another aspect that I would like to emphasize, which is also a global phenomenon, is the tightening labor market. Since many countries, including major economies, now experience falling unemployment rates, which in many cases actually reach their historical lows. Here we got unemployment rate in the EU and much lower in the US and Chinese economy. Also, the world unemployment rate is pretty low. But especially in major economies, we observe a significant decline in unemployment rates. Actually, decline that exceeded expectations of many economists, who often thought that it was the end of that drop in unemployment rate and that there was no more room for further decline. However, it turned out that reserves in terms of employment were higher than expected by many analysts. But demand for labor remains strong. However, taking into account the current demographic situation and supply of labor, it seems that there is not much room for further employment-led growth in many economies, including major economies. At the same time, we find out that more and more companies in a growing number of countries indicate that a major barrier to business development are labor shortages, so especially skilled labor force. That also leads us to question why wage and price pressures have not been very strong in recent years. There is some uptick in inflation, especially in the US economy. We could see it recently. But still, in many countries, including euro area, inflation remains below the central bank target. and inflation pressure was surprising. Inflation actually data was surprising on the downside actually relative to economist expectations. And China is also pretty stable. So it has been really puzzled why there has been no significant inflation growth in many countries over time. And there are a number of explanations here put forward by the IMF, for example. One is underestimation of the potential of economy. As I mentioned, many of us expected unemployment rate to reach its low at a given moment. However, it turned out that it could decline even more. So it indicates that the capacity of the economy turned out to be higher than expected by many economists, which means that we could still increase some employment without significant inflation pressure. It seems to be a valid point. But still, we reach the moment where such further growth based on employment increase seems to be very limited in major economies. Another explanation might be just expectations that companies do not believe that the recovery they experience is sustainable, so they are not willing to increase prices and wages and then prices. But it doesn't seem to be right if we look at the expectations and confidence indicators, which actually have been improving, and projections also seem to indicate that economic growth, at least in the few-year period, seems to be robust. Then other aspects that seem to be much more important are foreign competition, import-led disinflation, also enhanced tradability of services, which actually show that the impact on domestic prices is to a larger extent driven by foreign imports and foreign competition, especially foreign competition from countries with a lower price level. And it seems to be one of the factors that do play a role in explaining relatively low inflation pressure in many countries. And on the one hand, the IMF indicates that when you look at inflation processes worldwide, it seems that it is rather services than goods, especially in core inflation, so I do not mean energy prices here, that played more important role in disinflating many economies, which might indicate that it is rather maybe domestic policies, including some government policies that may have kept inflation at a low level in many countries. But it is rather based on traditional view that, that services are not tradable and goods are tradable goods. So goods are more exposed to foreign competition, while services not necessarily so. However, in recent years, also due to improvements in information communication technology, more and more services actually became cross-border tradables. So they are exposed more and more to foreign competition, so services may be actually provided by providers from different countries. So it may actually have been an important factor in influencing inflation in given countries. So my view is that in many countries, especially in very open economies, with very low unemployment rate, that are exposed to foreign competition, and now where companies are not able, due to foreign competition, to increase prices due to wage pressure because of foreign competition. In these countries, potential exchange rate depreciation may lead to a significant rebound in inflation, if that happens. To a rebound in inflation that would exceed the numbers that might be resulting from any econometric models used in different countries. We are in different world, in different situation, so I believe the impact of the exchange rate channel, depreciation of the exchange rate in countries with tight labor markets and open economies, actually that impact might be much stronger on price increase than suggested by estimations from econometric models. So we are going to see if that happens. Inflation leads us naturally to monetary policy of major central banks. So first of all, we have to emphasize that financial conditions or monetary policy still in major economies remain very supportive of economic growth. However, the ability to maintain high GDP growth with, at the same time, very low inflation rate seems to be limited. And that scenario seems to be much less likely in the years to come. Therefore, withdrawal of monetary policy support is either expected or is already underway in many countries. But still, the major central banks, I mean Fed, Bank of Japan, European central banks, all of them remain broadly cautious about the pace of tightening and timing and size of tightening movements. Obviously, the Fed, American central bank, is ahead of other major central banks in terms of a tightening cycle. So after a 7-year period of historical lows of federal funds rate, at the end of December 2015, there was a first interest rate hike by 25 basis points, followed by additional 5 rate hikes, the last one in March this year. And I would expect rather 3 than 2, we're going to see more interest rate hikes this year, to be followed by further tightening next year, probably 2 additional hikes. Again, we are going to see, but that happens in 2018. So monetary policy tightening in the US is underway. As for the European Central Bank, before interest rates increase, we are going to see first the end of the asset purchase program, so quantitative easing of the European Central Bank. It's going to happen this year, no sooner than in September, if not in December this year. This program is coming to an end. At the same time, interest rates increase of the ECB should rather not happen before the second quarter of 2018, if not in the second half of the next year. As for Bank of Japan, its loose monetary policy settings, I would not expect any significant change in its monetary policy this and the next year. But, so again, monetary policy tightening is very gradual. However, it is going to result in some financial tightening, which might be pretty impactful for these countries that are highly indebted with high debt, or also for companies and households with a significant debt, especially accumulated in emerging market economies, which are exposed to some spillover effects. That is, for example, capital flows to major economies affecting exchange rates and interest rates in emerging market economies, especially those economies that with an increased debt that has been accumulated in the last decade, where we experience very low, historically low interest rates. I will discuss it also at the end of the presentation. Maybe last 2 slides on doing business. In the major economies, what we may observe is that USA, in the period of 2008-2018, ranked between 3rd and now 6th position in total. There is only one European Union economy being ahead of the US, that is Denmark. EU actually EU countries actually rank behind the US, with the exception of Denmark, as I mentioned. And there were no significant changes of the US and EU economy in total in the doing business ranking. And the same goes for China, which experienced some improvement. I mean, here, the lower it is, the better it is. There was an improvement in doing business ranking in the case of China over the last 10 years has been pretty marginal. I mean, just an improvement by 8 positions. As for the EU, again, it was in total relatively stable. However, in the case of individual countries, we saw some more significant changes, especially in the case of Poland, which improved a lot in this ranking, but also Spain, which also has improved in the ranking of doing business relative to other countries. And in terms of economic freedom, this is the index of Heritage Foundation. US is also a top performer, and the European Union also is significantly above the average for the world. There has been some deterioration in the US over the last decade. So the difference between the US conditions and the European Union conditions in terms of economic freedom has narrowed, but still the US goes ahead of the European Union. China has caught up somewhat, but still stays below the average for the world economy in terms of economic freedom. So let's move to the risks and challenges. Some of them are certain that will have to be faced by the world economy, including major economies. So first, let me start with protectionism and tensions in the global trade. We may observe that in some economies, their support for globalization has weakened. Some trade agreements or economic arrangements are being revised or renegotiated, including NAFTA or Brexit, which is pretty obvious. So this potential escalation of protectionism and increase in tensions in trade, especially between the US and China, indeed would be a significant risk for the global economy. However, it is not a baseline scenario in my opinion, and since I believe there will be some tensions, but not very significant though. Still, many people seem to disregard them in the case of some EU countries based on their direct exposure to trade flows with China and US, indicating that for many EU economies, these are not major trading partners. However, it is a pretty short-sighted view since many European economies are exposed to China and US and other major economies, if not directly, then indirectly, be it through, for example, trade with Germany or other more indirect relationships related to global trade. And as I mentioned previously, we have shown that the exposure of European economies to global and foreign demand is much higher than in the case of the US or China on many countries. So they are much more dependent on foreign demand and trade development. And according to IMF calculations, it's just to show the results of the model, an increase in import prices by 10% worldwide due to, for example, an increase in protectionist measures leads to a decline in global output in the long term by 2%. The same goes for consumption, while at the same time investment and trade volumes decline by much more. In the case of trade, it is going to decline by 16% in the longer run, obviously provided that there is such an escalation of protectionist measures in the world economy. So it's just illustration. Again, it's not a baseline scenario. It's not, so its probability is pretty limited. Another factor that we may observe are increases in geopolitical tensions. So here we may observe that in the latest survey conducted by World Economic Forum, there were as many as 93% of respondents expecting that there would be worsening of political or economic frictions between major powers in 2018. So, and out of them, 40 percentage points expected a significant increase in these tensions. So on the one hand, it seems pretty serious. On the other hand, I would say these increased geopolitical tensions are a sort of new normal. Since over the last years, we have observed an increase in geopolitical tensions. And at the beginning, it seemed to have hampered and impacted on investment activity in many countries. But over time, investors seem to have got used to this. And an investment rebound is what we are currently experiencing. I mentioned about increased debt, indebtedness of many countries, but also of consumers and companies, which would be related to private debt. But in terms of public debt, it is worth to emphasize that many countries, including the world economy, experience a historically high level of indebtedness. Here we got data for public debt for the world, which amounts to 82% of global GDP, which is roughly similar to the debt for the European Union. In the US, it is higher, 108%. China it stayed at the level of 48% last year. But if we look at the last 10 years, we may notice that in almost every economy, there was a significant increase in public debt. The world economy is by 21 percentage points, not to mention many other countries. So this actually increases the exposure of these countries to any external turbulences or also increase in interest rates. So it also indicates that there is less room for maneuver and response to any adverse economic shocks in the global output. And the same goes also for financial tightening due to monetary policy normalization. That would also increase the debt servicing costs for these countries. So this is something they will have to face in the next years. And the last factor I would like to emphasize, but which is of critical importance, if not immediately, then in the medium to long term, it is demographics. First, let's discuss the data on the change in population. So we may observe that until 2060, according to projections, in this case of the United Nations, but it is very much in line with other institutions, we may observe that the world population is going to increase by almost 40% over the period until 2060. However, we may notice that demographic trends are very divergent across economies. On the one hand, we are going to see a significant increase in population in India and also US economy. At the same time, European Union is going to experience decline in population, and the same goes for China. And we see many European countries that are going to experience a significant contraction of population. For example, for Bulgaria, it's almost 1/3 contraction of their population. At the same time, we may notice that out of these economies, with the exception of small Luxembourg, there is no European Union country, no China, no even India, where an increase in population over that period would be higher than in the world. So that leads us to question, so where this population growth is coming from? So, well, answer is pretty simple. It's Africa. It's Africa where actually by 2060, population is to more than double, actually to increase by 2.5 times. And its share in the global economy from 2015, which is here, until 2060 is to increase from 16 to 29%. At the same time, it is worth to emphasize that Europe is the only continent in the world where population is going to contract. It's going to reduce by 6%. In all other continents, population is to grow over that time, especially in Africa, but also in Asia. So it actually may emphasize also an increasing role of immigration policies that these countries, especially in Europe, will have to deal with to compensate for workforce shortages. And even more striking, but common to almost every economy in the world, is the process of aging. So while there are divergences in terms of population growth in total, the common factor is that there is a significant, widespread, and pretty fast population aging. So let me explain what these graphs illustrate. They show the ratio of people at working age, here defined as people at the age of 20 to 64 years, relative to the number of people at the age of 65 or more. So this working age population relative to older people. We see that in the world, this ratio amounts to 6.9, more or less. The same is actually for China. In India, it's 10, enormously high. A lot of young, relatively young people compared to the number of people at the age of 65 or more. In the European Union, it's 3.2. In the US, it's 4.1. In 2016, this ratio is projected to decline heavily. Here, in every economy indicated on this graph, including the world economy, it's going to decline from 6.9 to 3.1. So it will be less than half of what we currently experience. In China, that decline is huge, from 6.9 to 1.7. This is a huge, huge difference, indicating that changes in the distribution of people in terms of their age will be enormous. So this will be an entirely different world, also indicating that in the countries with some guarantees in their social security systems, it will pose a very significant challenge, especially in advanced economies, to the sustainability of these social security systems. So this is the major challenge that will have to affect policies and economic performance of economies around the world. And the last slide on this is obviously that leads us to the question on robotics, automation technologies, that we may use them to address the problem of labor shortages in many countries. And indeed, what we may observe is that also the recent research of NBER indicates that there is a relationship between aging and increase in robotics, here in the number of industrial robots and the aging process. So the more significant the aging process, the higher implementation, introduction of robots in the industry in the countries. So this relationship seems to be pretty evident. However, robotics is mostly implemented and automation technologies in the blue-collar industries where there are some standardized procedures. So it will help, definitely in some sectors. However, at the level of total economy, it will definitely not solve the problem of workers' shortage, especially of shortages of skilled labor force. Okay, so let me summarize the key findings of the global economic of the assessment of current trends and the global economic outlook. So after rebound in 2017, 2018, in the current year, and the year that is to come, in the next year, the world economy is projected to grow by 3.9% annually. That is slightly higher than 2017, and much higher than in 2016. What is important is that global economy is enjoying a synchronized expansion, with major economies, including Euro area, Japan, China, and the US, growing above also expectations in the previous year. This global improvement is associated with growing trade and investment activity, the latter being very important in terms of improving capacity and potential of different economies. However, the growth prospects indicate that global economy and many major economies are not expected to return to their growth path that was experienced prior to the global financial crisis. It is, among others, due to population aging and decline in productivity growth compared to the previous period. Another phenomenon that we observe is that labor market is tightening. Many countries actually experience record low levels of unemployment, and there seems to be very limited room for further employment-led growth, especially in major economies. And more companies seem to confirm this, indicating in an increasing number of countries that labor shortages, especially skilled labor shortages, are an ever-growing barrier to their business development. Well, despite tight labor markets and despite increasing demand in many countries, wage and price pressures have remained pretty subdued over the recent years, which came as a surprise to many economists. And at the same time, this is one of the factors that major central banks remain pretty cautious on the pace and size of tightening of their monetary policy, but still monetary policy normalization is underway. It should be expected also in the years to come. While global economy outlook, I would say in the short term, it should not be affected strongly by many risks or challenges that I just discussed. So it should not be derailed in the short term, this positive outlook. However, in the medium to long term, there are obviously a number of risks and challenges. Some of them are certain and will have to be faced by many economies. They include, obviously, protectionism and potential escalation of global tensions, geopolitical tensions, which, again, as I mentioned, seem to be a new normal in the economy, increased debt of many economies, but also of consumers and companies in some countries that increase their exposure to potential global turbulences, but also to financial tightening, which will increase debt servicing costs. And last but not least, demographic changes, where in terms of population growth, they are pretty divergent, but the common factor is widespread and fast aging that will obviously affect many economies in terms of access to labor force and labor force participation rates, and also sustainability of social security systems, especially in major economies. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rozkrut. We may have some time for the questions. Any questions from the floor? Peter?
Yeah, hi, this is Peter Marcus from World Steel Dynamics. What you didn't mention, it appears that in many countries, they are now using gearing, which is borrowing money to grow, as they did from 2000 through 2008. The question is, how powerful is this a development, and at what point are loans so high, does debt go up so much that we run into the same problem we did in 2008?
You just mentioned they used what? I'm sorry.
Gearing, borrowing money to grow.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, I did mention that in many countries, they use this period, the last decade of very low interest rates, to increase the debt. And this actually, indeed, does increase their exposure to financial tightening. So they leverage a lot, and one of the risks that I discussed is increased in public debt, but also in the debt of companies and consumers that use external financing to finance their spending. And actually, it does increase their exposure as one of major risks that I just mentioned.
What year?
Oh.
So when is the risk? In what year is there too much debt and it all tumbles down?
Well, I'm not proficient in projecting crisis, but I believe what maybe is forecasted is monetary policy normalization, which would take its pace, I would expect, mostly in 2020, since in 2018-19, that would be more evident in the US. However, as for other major economies, I believe it would be mostly in 2020 and beyond, where, especially if, for example, in the US, monetary policy tightening will coincide also with a reversal of fiscal policy relaxation in the US, because now we are going to experience changes in the tax policy affecting the economy, adding to the growth of the US economy that will bring it also above potential output, which will increase inflation pressure. So after 2020, you might expect some maybe tightening of fiscal policy, which may actually coincide with the effects of tightening of monetary policy of the Fed. So that would be maybe 2021 or so. If that happens, that would also affect the global economy, increase the risk aversion, and would affect global currencies and interest rates, especially in emerging market economies that are indebted. So that would exert very negative effects on their ability actually to finance their debt and to grow in a stable way. So that, in terms of projection, again, it's not a very easy question, but I would say it's beyond 2020, 21 or so.
Thank you. Jim?
Mr. Rozkrut, thank you for your presentation. I have a question about the protectionism that's increasing in the global trade. You also mentioned it in your presentation. It's increasing more and more, and especially in the steel world, we're feeling this increasingly the past year. So my question is, where is this going to end? And isn't it in the long-term benefit of the humankind and economy to have free trade? So what is the world doing by increasing protectionism this way, and where do you see this being headed? Thank you very much.
Personally, I would not expect, a sharp end of this debate, discussion. Yeah, there is too much politics, also driven by political cycle in many countries, political promises made by politicians you all know. That actually, I would expect a sort of game and play to go on, but still, I believe that words would be more significant than deeds in terms of their actual impact. So there may be some statements indicating maybe in some area escalation. After we don't know actually how it also lead to new conflicts, like potential conflicts with Iran, because now we got some alleviation of tensions in the case of Korean Peninsula. But again, new actually sources of conflicts may emerge. They may impact also conflicts between major economies, because they may have different interests in this area, and may also impact on their trade relationships. However, I would expect them to be short-lived, but the whole process would continue. But its total impact, in my opinion, would not be very strong, since actually it's a lose-lose strategy. Nobody wins, with the exception of some maybe individual industries, but at the cost of the whole economy.
I must thank you for an excellent presentation. I'm from India, the world's second largest producers of steel now. I think you adequately covered a lot of things concerning India, the aging, the other relevant things. Two very specific questions. One is, if the world economy is showing recovery, growth all over, is a GDP growth linkage to the steel consumption is going to change, and if so, how it will be, because it is the overall impact. Second, when you said automation within that, perhaps there is another change which is coming. I don't know whether my other friends will understand. The real change in the kind of consumption that is going to come up. And that is, for example, the fuel change in the cars. How will that impact the consumption? And if that is the trend, how it will have an impact on your GDP? Reverse impact. Thank you.
Thank you. So first of all, as for steel, what I mentioned is, first of all, the GDP growth in total is increasing. At the same time, in China, there is some decline in, for example, industry, in the share of industry, that is going to decrease in its role relative to services, and also the domestic consumption, that is going to be emphasized by Chinese authorities. At the same time, the investment rate, which is pretty important, especially in industry, manufacturing, and construction, is going to increase slightly, but in the world economy increasing from 25 to 26%, while the total economy is growing at the same time. It's obviously a positive scenario. So again, China is going to invest still a lot, while its investment rate is declining, but again, the total economy is growing. It's growing at a slower pace than previously, but still at the pace exceeding the average for other emerging market economies. So I would say it's a moderately positive scenario. As for automation technologies, well, I would say, in terms of labor first, I believe robotics automation will mostly affect blue-collar industries. But when it comes to more skilled, as some services, I believe that more important would be development of artificial intelligence. That might be more impactful, but we're going to see it still. Actually, we already observed some first implementations of AI, but still it's too early to understand how it will affect, for example, services and more qualified labor force. So still, but when it comes to robotics and automation at the, not at the industry level, but the economy-wide level, it doesn't seem to be a substitute, but rather complementary, also allowing labor force to improve its productivity, but also increases the importance of shortages of skilled labor force, which, since actually automation and robotics increases the demand for skilled labor force at the same time. As for automotive, industry, fuel consumption, and so on, well, but at the same time, we may observe an increase in demand for electric cars, which also, well, increases demand for some metals to some extent. At the same time, consumption, the pattern and structure of consumption, yeah, will change, obviously, due to automation technologies, but it will also change due to demographic changes, which I also mentioned, which may be even more impactful and significant than other processes would imply. But what would be the share of a given services products? I can't answer that. So.
Thank you. A couple of more questions.
Good morning, Dr. Marek. I'm Mark Ma from China. I think maybe very few Chinese here, right? You talk a lot about China. I have a very specific question about the competitiveness of Poland as maybe a major economic body in Europe in the future. So could you tell me something in detail, if possible, otherwise generally, what is the energy competitiveness for Poland to develop its industries, basically power and energy and gas? I'm going to think to make Poland a candidate for my 100,000 tons graphite electrode plant. This is very important for me, and this could be a very good news for steel manufacturers in Europe and in other parts of the world. Thank you.
So that probably would need a separate presentation in Poland, actually, which I have a couple. But for the Polish economy, I would say that what we have distinguished ourselves relative to also other countries in the region has been stability of growth, both in terms of the past track record, but also if you look at the projections, it may no longer be the highest, but they are actually the most stable, or one of the most stable. So if you look both at the past and expected future, we distinguish ourselves in terms of stability. Also a relatively big domestic market that at times of cyclical downturns may compensate for these global tensions for some time. So this is one of the explanations, because it's very actually I would have to spend a lot of time to discuss why Poland was the only economy in the European Union that had not suffered from a recession at during global financial crisis. So we always, all the time, we have experienced a positive GDP growth. I believe that in terms of also the strengths that we do have as a skilled labor force, well-educated, so with very high ratio of actually people graduating from universities. However, our education is mostly good at the primary and medium level, at high schools, but when it comes to university, it is no longer that robust. But so speaking languages also, flexibility, pretty flexible labor force. At this moment, we are a pretty young population. However, projections are not very favorable in terms of demographic trends, since our aging process in Poland will be one of the fastest. So it's not, but again, in the few-year period, well, it will still benefit from this favorable demographic situation as such now. Increase in productivity has been witnessed. Still, what we have to face, again, is limited access to labor force right now, and also using the reserves that we have perfectly used over the last decades, 2 decades, in terms of benefiting from low labor costs that allow us to also increase our share in different markets and compete with foreign producers. As for energy prices and other prices, they are to a large extent, again, influenced by long-term contracts that we have. Still, we are dependent on gas supply from Russia. And obviously, we know that there are some energy prices in Poland are also heavily influenced by regulation related also to EU regulations, but implemented at the country level. But we had also some reliefs for excise, for example, taxation for electricity, for steel industry in the previous years. But again, there is an ongoing debate on, I would say, energy-intensive industries with public authorities, so it's difficult to comment on them right now at this stage.
Thank you. One question from Mr. Venkat here, and then Sandeep will have the next question.
Hi, Venkat, representing Jazeera Steel Oman. I think it's a follow-up to the other gentleman's question. Where is WTO in all this? Is that as an organization finished and over? Huh? I mean, seriously, is there anything happening which you people in Europe know better than we do?
Actually, could you rephrase, because I heard...
The question is about WTO.
Oh.
What do they do about all of this protectionism?
Yeah, definitely. I fully agree that...
Is it totally over, or...?
Yeah, it's a very valid question that we also, discuss here in Poland. What is the role of WTO? But we know, especially that WTO, the major member of WTO is the US. So definitely should play a role, and I believe the pressures would be increased, intensified by especially European Union authorities, China and other countries to use WTO platform to discuss these protectionist measures. But again, there's a lot of politics, so from the economic point of view, it's again difficult to discuss it for me, but I believe that WTO could be used, especially when protectionist measures would escalate. At this stage, I believe that would be rather, bilateral discussions at the political level that would alleviate them. And so I believe that off-the-record discussions look entirely different than those that we see on Twitter, for example.
May also be involved, related with who is involved and who is not. Anyway, next question, Sandeep.
So my question is a little longer dated question, and it relates to what you were talking about earlier about the dynamics of the population. What we've seen so far in the world is aging populations have mostly happened in first world countries which are already quite wealthy, for example, Japan, which is the major change, the dependency ratio change that's going to come in the next few years, is that we're going to see more middle income and poor countries where these unfunded obligations to elderly people are going to become an issue. And though we've been talking about the economic effects, this is definitely going to lead to political effects, changes in the voting way people vote, because they want to be taken care of as they age. And though we haven't mentioned it, I'm sure the politics is going to play a significant role on the economics. Do you have any comment on that?
Thank you.
Now, indeed, these are very major changes. In some economies, aging will start to take its toll, especially in developed economies, as you mentioned. That will be, in terms of its impact on social security system, because their sustainability will be affected, and it will either have to result in lower pensions or increased taxation of labor. But again, if you increase taxation of labor, at the time when you compete for skilled labor force, that would mean, well, international competition. So that would be, there will be significant economic arguments against that. At the same time, developed economies, where there are mostly prevailing democracies, we may observe that there will be more and more voters at the pension age who are retired. So their preferences would be, if short-term, might be for higher pension benefits. And at the same time, what we observe that without increasing retirement age, which is one natural answer. So even if formally, politically it would be difficult to increase retirement age, which we actually observe in Poland. The retirement age was increased, but the current government promised before the elections that they would reverse it back to the previous level. And it actually happened. So I doubt that increasing retirement age would be an easy option in the short term due to political reasons. But at the same time, you may do it indirectly, right? Implement some conditions that will allow you to retire at the official age. So like at least the minimum number of years that you have to spend on the labor market to be allowed to be entitled to retirement, to pension benefits. So I believe it would be increased indirectly because there is no other option. And well, one of the solutions obviously is immigration policy, but now it doesn't seem to be well designed in these countries, so they will have to face this challenge at the same time. But in the less developed economies, the problem would be that actually they often do not have like social security systems in force. So traditionally, I mean, these grandparents were supported by their kids. Question is, if there are such significant changes in the numbers of elderlies relative to workers, whether that will be possible. So a sort of, again, social security solutions will have to be implemented to address that problem. But I do believe this is the major problem. One of solutions would be to increase retirement age, but also improve the health of people to be able to work longer. At the same time, immigration policies due to divergent trends in terms of population growth should also be introduced. And one also more comment is there is maybe, we discussed trade wars, but there might be also generation conflicts, right? Because what we observe, especially in developed economies, that under current system, while pension benefits in real terms are going to increase somewhat, the ratio of average pension to average wage is decreasing and is going to increase a lot, which means that the change in the income, disposable income, after retirement will be more and more significant in negative terms, obviously, which will also increase expectations of future pensioners to compensate for this gap in the income that they will face after retirement.
Thank you. Can we have one last question?
Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. Really, it was all relevant and very, very good presentation. I have a question on one of your graphs. If you were to, that's okay. I mean, I think we can just talk about it. I think it's safe to say that there's a correlation between the GDP growth and the consumption of steel. So I noticed that in your graph, the GDP growth for China is going down over the years. U.S. and Europe is slightly going up for a few years and then and really starting going constant. And interestingly, even though China is coming down, you put the world as steady and going almost the same. So with that assumption, obviously there's a steel usage will be, let's say, going up for a few years for Europe and US, and for the rest of the world it's almost constant. If China is going down, where will be where do you expect the steel consumption or GDP growth to happen?
So GDP growth is going to happen, I mean, better GDP growth than in previous years in many commodity exporters. Emerging Asia, I mean, it's not only China. We got acceleration in economic growth in India as one major economy. The economic growth is not to be very robust according to projections in Brazil or Russia, but again, many other Asian economies, emerging Asian economies, are going to grow at fast pace, and commodity exporters, again, as I mentioned, also sub-Saharan, not sub-Saharan, but MENA, Middle East, and economies are also growing at a faster pace. So these emerging, especially economies, their pace of growth will offset to some extent this somewhat, but not very significant slowdown in other major economies, with exception on India, for which the growth projections indicate further acceleration in economic growth. And so that, and Africa obviously would be another story. I haven't distinguished Africa in terms of economic growth because I focus on major economies, but in the longer term, obviously, this is the area where we could also expect a lot of investment activity. And again, as I mentioned, it is not also GDP, but also its structure. So from that perspective, increase in investment rate is obviously a positive also a scenario that should be accounted for.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Mr. Rozkrut, for this very good presentation and the answers. Let's have a 15-20 minutes break, and then we are going to continue with the second session.